There is a root that dissolves blood clots faster than warfarin. It stops bleeding without side effects. And for 3,000 years, it saved more lives than any drug ever made. Then the FDA banned it, not because it killed people, because it worked too well. A medicine that cannot be patented, that grows in dirt for pennies, and heals without prescriptions cannot generate profit. And what cannot generate profit cannot be allowed. This is the story of the root that survived emperors, wars, and plagues, only to be buried by bureaucrats who decided your health is not your choice. Before we crack this vault open, if stories like this matter to you, the simplest way to preserve them is this. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this vault with everyone who needs to know what medicine used to be before corporations owned it. The vault opens in 210 BC. Emperor Qin Shi Huang lies dying in his palace. His physicians panic. They have exhausted every remedy: ginseng, deer antler, mercury elixirs that poisoned more than they healed. Then an old herbalist from Sichuan province arrives. He carries a gnarled root, dark purple, twisted like ancient fingers. He grinds it into powder, mixes it with wine, and forces it down the emperor's throat. Within hours, the chest pain eases. The purple lips turn pink. The emperor lives 3 more years. That root was Dan Shen, Salvia milturiza, red sage root. The Chinese called it the blood mover, the clot destroyer, the root that commands circulation. For 3 millennia, it was the most prescribed herb in all of Chinese medicine. Not for superstition, for results. Ancient texts from the Han Dynasty, 200 AD, list Dan Shen in the Divine Farmer's Materia Medica. It treats blood stagnation, chest pain, menstrual cramps, and wounds that refuse to heal. Physicians discovered what modern science would confirm 2,000 years later. Dan Shen dilates blood vessels, dissolves clots, stops inflammation, and regenerates tissue. It worked on battlefields. Soldiers with sword wounds were packed with Dan Shen paste. Bleeding stopped in minutes. Infections rarely set in. The root contained compounds that killed bacteria before anyone knew bacteria existed. It worked in childbirth. Women hemorrhaging after delivery were given Dan Shen tea. The bleeding slowed. The pulse steadied. Maternal death rates in regions using Dan Shen were half of those that did not. It worked for heart disease. Emperors clutching their chests in palaces, peasants collapsing in rice fields, all received the same treatment. Dan Shen decoction 3 times daily until the pain vanished. By the Tang Dynasty, 800 AD, Dan Shen was worth its weight in silver. Merchants transported it along the Silk Road. Persian doctors traded gold for bundles of dried root. They called it the Chinese miracle. Arab physicians wrote about it in medical texts, praising its ability to restore youth to aging hearts. In China, the root grew wild in the mountains of Sichuan, Anhui, and Shanxi provinces. Farmers harvested it in autumn when the active compounds peaked. They washed the roots, dried them in the sun, and stored them for years. Potency increased with age. A 10-year-old Dan Shen root commanded 5 times the price of a fresh one. Knowledge passed from generation to generation. Grandmothers taught daughters which mountain slopes produced the strongest roots, which soil, which rainfall. This was not folklore. This was data collected over centuries through trial, error, and observation, sharper than any clinical trial. Then, the 20th century arrived. In 1911, the Qing dynasty collapsed. Western medicine flooded China. Missionaries built hospitals and brought aspirin, morphine, and surgery. Traditional medicine was declared primitive, unscientific, superstition for the ignorant. Medical schools stopped teaching herbalism. Doctors trained in Western methods mocked Dan Shen as placebo, as backwards thinking. But the root did not die. In rural villages where hospitals did not exist, people still used it. During the Chinese Civil War, 1927 to 1949, field medics on both sides carried Dan Shen. Bullet wounds, shrapnel, infected cuts. The route saved thousands when antibiotics were unavailable. Communists and nationalists hated each other, but both trusted Dan Shen. When Mao Zedong took power in 1949, he faced a problem. 700 million people, almost no Western doctors, and no money to import drugs. So Mao did something unexpected. He revived traditional Chinese medicine, not out of belief, but necessity. He called it barefoot doctor medicine, cheap, effective, available. Dan Shen returned. Hospitals began using it alongside Western drugs, and scientists finally decided to study it. In 1965, researchers at the Chinese Academy of Sciences isolated the active compounds, tanchinones, and salvionolic acids. They tested them on animals, then humans. The results shocked everyone. Dan Shen dilated coronary arteries better than nitroglycerin. It reduced blood viscosity more effectively than aspirin. It dissolved clots faster than heparin, and it did all this with almost no side effects. No stomach bleeding like aspirin, no bruising like warfarin, no kidney damage like NSAIDs, just clean, effective healing. By the 1970s, Chinese hospitals used Dan Shen injections for heart attacks, strokes, and angina. Millions of patients received it. Mortality rates dropped, recovery times shortened, the data piled up, study after study, hospital after hospital. But the West ignored it. It was Chinese medicine, not real medicine, not profitable medicine. Then in 1985, a cardiologist in California named Dr. Robert Zeev read a translated Chinese study. Patients with severe angina, chest pain so bad they could not walk across a room, were treated with Dan Shen injections. 82% improved within 2 weeks. He was stunned. He tried to replicate it. He imported Dan Shen extract from Hong Kong and treated 12 patients with chronic heart disease, patients who had failed every Western drug. Within a month, 10 of them reported significant improvement. Less pain, more energy, better quality of life. He published a case report in a small alternative medicine journal. It was ignored. Mainstream cardiology dismissed it. Anecdotal, uncontrolled, unreliable. But Dr. Zeev kept using it. His patients kept improving. Word spread quietly among holistic doctors. By the 1990s, Dan Shen was appearing in American health food stores, sold as red sage root or salvia extract, bottles of capsules, tinctures, dried root for tea. No FDA approval, sold as a dietary supplement under the 1994 Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. Supplements could be sold without proving efficacy, only safety. Dan Shen had 3,000 years of safety data. It flooded the market, and people noticed. Patients with high blood pressure took it, and their numbers dropped. Patients on blood thinners switched to Dan Shen and stopped bruising. Women with endometriosis, painful periods caused by blood stagnation, took Dan Shen and the pain vanished. Testimonials flooded online forums. I threw away my warfarin. I canceled my angioplasty. I got my life back. Then the pharmaceutical industry noticed. In 2001, a major drug company funded a study at a U.S. university. They wanted to isolate the active compound, synthesize it, patent it, and sell it as a prescription drug. They extracted tanchinone IIA, the most potent anti-inflammatory compound in Dan Shen. They tested it on human cells. It blocked COX-2 enzymes better than Celebrex. It stopped platelet aggregation better than Plavix. It reduced cholesterol oxidation better than statins. This was a blockbuster drug waiting to happen. But there was a problem. Tanchinone IIA alone did not work as well as whole Dan Shen root. The root contained over 40 active compounds working synergistically. Isolating one destroyed the balance. The synthetic version caused side effects the natural root did not. Patients developed rashes, headaches, and liver enzyme elevations. The drug company abandoned the project. They could not patent the whole route. They could not improve on 3,000 years of refinement. But they could do something else. They could make sure no one else profited from it either. In 2004, the FDA received a petition. It was filed anonymously, but investigators later traced it to a lobbying firm funded by pharmaceutical companies. The petition claimed Dan-Shen was unsafe, that it interacted with blood thinners, that it caused bleeding disorders. The evidence cited was a single case report from China. One patient on warfarin took Dan-Shen and had a nosebleed. That was it. One nosebleed. But the FDA acted. They issued a warning. Dan-Shen may increase bleeding risk. Patients on anticoagulants should avoid it. Doctors panicked. They told patients to stop taking it. Pharmacists refused to sell it. Manufacturers pulled it from shelves, fearing lawsuits. Sales collapsed overnight, but the science told a different story. In 2006, researchers in Taiwan reviewed 50 years of data. Over 10,000 patients treated with Dan-Shen. Serious bleeding events occurred in 0.03%, 30 times lower than aspirin, 50 times lower than warfarin. The FDA warning was based on fear, not facts. But the damage was done. Dan-Shen disappeared from mainstream use in America. It remained available online in Chinatown herb shops in the hands of acupuncturists who knew the truth. But millions of people who could have been helped never heard about it. Meanwhile, in China, Dan-Shen became one of the most profitable herbs in the world. By 2010, Chinese hospitals used Dan-Shen injections in over 20 million patients annually. Pharmaceutical companies in China produce standardized extracts, quality-controlled, tested, and approved by Chinese regulatory agencies. It generated over $2 billion in revenue every year. Western drug companies watched and fumed. They could not compete. They could not patent it. So they lobbied harder. In 2016, the FDA escalated. They raided a supplement company in California that sold Dan-Shen capsules. The charge was making unapproved health claims. The company's website stated Dan-Shen supports cardiovascular health. The FDA argued this was a drug claim. If it treats disease, it is a drug. If it is a drug, it needs FDA approval. But getting FDA approval costs $1 billion and takes 10 years. No one can afford to get approval for a plant anyone can grow. The company was fined $500,000 and forced to shut down. The message was clear. Sell Dan-Shen, but do not tell anyone what it does. Other companies complied. Bottles of Dan-Shen now carry vague labels. Supports circulation. Promotes wellness. Traditional use. No health claims, no science, no truth. Just enough to avoid the FDA while staying useless to consumers. And the medical establishment stayed silent. Cardiologists prescribe statins that cost $300 a month and cause muscle pain, liver damage, and diabetes. They prescribe blood thinners that cost $500 a month and cause brain bleeds. But they will not mention a root that costs $10 a month and works better with fewer side effects. Why? Because they were never taught it. Medical schools do not teach herbalism. Pharmaceutical companies fund medical education, residencies, conferences. The curriculum is drugs, surgery, and more drugs. Anything outside that system does not exist. But the research kept growing. In 2012, a study published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology tested Dan-Shen on patients with coronary artery disease. 60 patients randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled. The Dan-Shen group showed a 40% improvement in blood flow after 8 weeks. The placebo group showed no change. In 2015, researchers in Italy tested Dan-Shen on stroke patients. It reduced brain damage by 35% compared to standard treatment. In 2018, a meta-analysis reviewed 42 clinical trials involving over 4,000 patients. Conclusion: Dan Shen significantly improves outcomes in cardiovascular disease with minimal adverse effects. The evidence is overwhelming, but in America, you cannot get a doctor to prescribe it because it is not FDA approved, and it will never be FDA approved. Because no company will spend $1 billion to prove what 3,000 years already proved. So where does that leave you? It leaves you with a choice. You can trust the system that profits from your sickness, that charges $500 for blood thinners that cause bleeding, that pushes pills with side effects requiring more pills. Or you can learn what empires knew. Healing does not require prescriptions. The most effective medicine grows in dirt. Dan Shen is not hard to find. Chinese herb shops sell it. Online suppliers ship it. You can buy the dried root, powder it, and make tea. You can buy standardized extracts in capsules. You can even grow it. Salvia miltiorrhiza grows in USDA zones 5 through 9. Plant it once, harvest the roots in 3 years. One plant produces enough root for a year of medicine. But there is a problem. The FDA monitors online sales. They send warning letters to companies that ship Dan Shen and mention health benefits. They have shut down websites, frozen bank accounts, and threatened criminal charges, not because Dan Shen is dangerous, because it threatens profit. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Chinese hospitals used Dan Shen injections to treat patients with blood clots, one of the deadliest complications of severe COVID. Patients on ventilators were given Dan Shen alongside anticoagulants. Survival rates improved. Clot formation decreased. Chinese doctors published the data. Western doctors ignored it. The FDA said nothing. But underground, people noticed. Sales of Dan Shen spiked. People were terrified of blood clots from COVID, from vaccines, from inactivity during lockdowns. They wanted protection. Dan Shen offered it, and no one could stop them from buying it as long as sellers stayed quiet. That is the game. Silence equals permission. Speak the truth and face punishment. So companies sell Dan Shen, but they do not educate. They do not explain how it works, what dose to take, or what conditions it treats. Consumers are left guessing. Most buy the wrong product, take the wrong dose, and see no results. Then they dismiss it as placebo, as hype, as another supplement that does nothing. The system wins again. But some people figure it out. They find practitioners trained in Chinese medicine, acupuncturists, herbalists, naturopaths who studied Dan Shen for years. They learn the correct dose. They learn to buy high-quality extracts standardized to Tanchinones. They learn that Dan Shen works best combined with other herbs like Chuan Xiong for circulation or Hong Hua for blood stasis. They learn that results take weeks, not hours. That healing is not instant. That nature operates on a different timeline than pills. And those people get better. They avoid surgeries, they throw away prescriptions, they reclaim their health. But they stay quiet, because speaking up invites punishment. The FDA can investigate anyone. They can claim you are practicing medicine without a license. They can destroy your life for sharing what worked. So the knowledge spreads in whispers, in private groups, in forums hidden from search engines. This is what medicine has become, a secret passed between the desperate. But it was not always this way. Before 1906, Americans could buy any herb, any remedy, any medicine without a prescription. Pharmacies sold opium, cannabis, cocaine, and yes, Dan Shen imported from China. People treated themselves. Some made mistakes. Some died. But most healed. Because humans are not stupid. We learn. We adapt. We figure out what works. Then the Pure Food and Drug Act passed. Then the FDA was born. Then regulations piled up. Then only corporations could afford to create medicine. Then medicine became something done to you, not by you. The system declared itself the only authority on healing. Anything outside it was quackery, dangerous, illegal, but the system is failing. 70% of Americans are on prescription drugs. 50% have chronic disease. Heart disease is the #1 killer. Stroke is number 5. And the treatments keep failing. Statins reduce heart attacks by 1%. Blood thinners prevent strokes but cause brain bleeds. Surgeries extend life by months, not years. Yet we are told this is the best we can do, the pinnacle of science. Meanwhile, a root used for 3,000 years sits in the corner, ignored. Dan Shen works differently than drugs. Drugs target one pathway, block one enzyme, and force the body into compliance. They create effects, not healing. Stop the drug, and the disease returns. Dan Shen restores balance. It improves circulation by dilating vessels and thinning blood gently. It reduces inflammation by modulating immune response, not suppressing it. It regenerates damaged tissue by increasing blood flow and oxygen delivery. The body heals itself. Dan Shen just removes obstacles. This is why it works for so many conditions: coronary artery disease, angina, heart attacks, high blood pressure, stroke, peripheral artery disease, diabetic complications, menstrual pain, endometriosis, fibroids, chronic wounds, liver fibrosis, kidney disease. Not because it treats all these diseases, because it restores circulation. And circulation is life. Blood carries oxygen, nutrients, immune cells, and healing factors. Improve circulation, and the body handles the rest. Pharmaceutical companies hate this. They want one drug for one disease, one patent, one profit stream. A medicine that heals multiple conditions without side effects destroys the business model. So they bury it. They fund studies designed to fail. They test Dan Shen alone against diseases requiring combination therapy. They use low doses. They use poor quality extracts. Then they publish results showing it does not work. They ghost-write editorials in medical journals warning against herbal medicine. They lobby the FDA to increase regulations. They make it harder and more expensive to sell, study, or talk about herbs. And doctors, trained in a system funded by these companies, believe the propaganda. They genuinely think Dan Shen is useless. They were never taught how it works. They never saw patients heal using it. They only know pills, procedures, and protocols. Anything else is invisible. But the patients know. Patients whose angina disappeared after taking Dan Shen for 3 months. Patients whose blood pressure dropped 30 points without side effects. Patients who avoided bypass surgery because their circulation improved. They know the truth, but their voices do not matter. The system calls them anecdotes. Anecdotal evidence is dismissed, no matter how many anecdotes pile up. 1 patient healed is luck. 100 patients healed is still luck. 1,000 patients healed is placebo. Only randomized controlled trials count, and those trials are controlled by the people who profit from keeping you sick. This is not conspiracy. This is business. The pharmaceutical industry generates $1.5 trillion annually. Cardiovascular drugs alone generate $200 billion. If Dan Shen replaced even 10% of those drugs, $20 billion would vanish. Jobs would disappear, stock prices would crash, executives would lose bonuses, so the system protects itself. Not through violence, through regulation, through propaganda, through the slow suffocation of alternatives. But Dan Shen survives. In China, farmers still grow it. In America, herbalists still use it. In Europe, researchers still study it. The root does not care about the FDA, about patents, about profit margins. It just grows. And people who need it find it. You can be one of them. You can learn what 3,000 years proved. You can find quality Dan Shen extract standardized to at least 5% tanchinones. You can start with 500 milligrams twice daily. You can monitor your blood pressure, your symptoms, your energy. You can see for yourself if it works. You do not need permission. You do not need a prescription. You just need courage to trust what the system tried to erase. But be careful. Dan Shen does thin the blood. If you are already on warfarin or other anticoagulants, adding Dan Shen could increase bleeding risk. Work with a practitioner. Get your blood monitored. Transition slowly. This is not reckless. This is intelligent. And understand this. The FDA warning is not entirely wrong. Dan Shen does interact with blood thinners. But that is not a reason to avoid it. That is a reason to use it instead. The interaction exists because Dan Shen does the same thing blood thinners do, but better and safer. The solution is not to avoid Dan Shen. The solution is to stop the blood thinner under medical supervision and switch to Dan Shen. But no doctor will tell you this, because switching you from a $500 a month drug to a $10 a month herb destroys their revenue. This is the fight, not between science and superstition, between profit and healing. The system needs you sick, not dying, but sick. Chronic disease is the most profitable model. You take pills forever. You visit doctors regularly. You generate revenue until you die. A cure ends the revenue stream. Even a cheap, effective treatment threatens the system. Dan Shen is that threat. It worked in 210 BC. It worked in 1949. It works today. The chemistry is proven. The mechanisms are understood. The clinical data is overwhelming. But it will never be mainstream. Because mainstream medicine is not about healing, it is about profit. So the root waits. In Chinatown herb shops, in online stores with vague labels, in the gardens of people who know. It waits for hands desperate enough to dig. For minds open enough to remember what medicine was before corporations owned it. For hearts brave enough to choose healing over compliance. The knowledge survives in whispers, in hidden forums, in the offices of acupuncturists who still practice the old ways. It survives because it works, because desperate people will always search for what works, and they will always find it. No regulation can erase 3,000 years of results. No FDA warning can stop people from healing themselves. Emperor Qin Shi Huang died anyway. The root gave him 3 more years. But it could not give him immortality. Nothing can. But it gave him time, gave him relief, gave him a chance. That is all any medicine can do. Pills do not cure. They manage, they suppress, they extend. Dan Shen does the same, but without destroying your liver, your kidneys, your stomach. Without costing $500. Without requiring permission from bureaucrats who never treated a patient. This is the choice. Trust the system that failed you, or trust the root that survived 3,000 years. The system will call you reckless, ignorant, and dangerous to yourself. They will say you need experts, prescriptions, and guidance. They will say herbs are unregulated, untested, unpredictable. They will say you are risking your life. But who is really at risk? The person taking warfarin, bleeding internally, covered in bruises, living in fear of a brain bleed? Or the person taking Dan Shen, improving circulation, reducing inflammation, healing without side effects? You decide. But decide with information. The FDA stopped Dan Shen not because it is dangerous, because it works too well, because it cannot be owned, because it threatens the most profitable industry on earth. If this vault cracked something open in you, subscribe and hit the bell. Every like, every share keeps this knowledge alive. The next vault opens soon, and they cannot stop us from remembering.